Welcome back to my channel, Rotorheads. Today we are flying to a crash scene, an aircraft, commercial airliner crash in the California hills to illustrate a point of realism. The crash scene is provided free of charge by LifeNet on flightsim.to. I highly recommend, if you're into helicopters and rescues and that sort of thing, he is your go-to guy for creating those scenarios. They're really good. He specializes in tight landing zones. With my encouragement, I like the challenge of putting a helicopter down in the most difficult spots. So he's all about that, and I recommend that you grab some of his work. I would describe the flight sim community as a spectrum, starting with the gamers, going all the way out to the pilots that get their annual check rides in a full flight simulator. At the gamer end, that cohort likes to just play. They want to get in, they ride, and it's a point and shoot style game, and they love that. And there's nothing wrong with that. On the other extreme end, there are serious, sober pilots that need to make sure that their skills are up to date so that they can handle any emergency that comes their way. And there are at least two groups in between. And I would describe myself to be approximately in the dead center of all of that spectrum. And that dead center is people who want to be in a flight simulator, who want to experience flight simulation with as much realism as possible without getting into all the administrative aspects and the details of all the possible contingencies that may happen in a commercial space. And I'm happy to say that Flight Sim, Microsoft's Flight Sim, does provide a substantial amount of that. We certainly have the visual realism of what we see in a normal flight experience. The flight models are reasonably accurate in most circumstances, and they can reasonably be asked to improve incrementally to get a better realism. Places like hover or drafts in tight spaces and that sort of thing. But there are other areas that are completely unincorporated, unimplemented in the flight model. And I will admit, yes, these are fringe cases. They are not normal flight parameters, but they are part of flying the vehicle, and they are instrumental in understanding how the vehicle actually flies and what the limitations are. Now, why does this matter? I think it matters because if you're a person who values the realism in flying, specifically a helicopter, it's not just about flying around and seeing the landscape, it's about the feeling of actually being a pilot. If you can't or won't actually be a pilot, feeling like you are actually a pilot is a useful and desirable thing. And if you're not really flying the model the way a real pilot would, then it's not really the same thing. It's kind of like a gamer mentality where you're just pointing and going, and it doesn't matter how fast you're pushing the vehicle or what the air resistance is or what the flight dynamics are. You're just going and having fun, which is fine. But for a person who's valuing realism, the handling of the vehicle matters. If you handle the vehicle in such a way as it would self-destruct in the air, then you're kind of kidding yourself that you're being realistic and being a pilot. And you would not want to actually ever get into a helicopter because you've trained your mind to operate the thing in such a way as that you would surely cause damage, injury, or death. So having said that, let's step into the first item. It is called VRS, Vortex Ring State. That is when a helicopter comes into a situation where it either stops abruptly in the air or descends too rapidly and falls through its own column of descending air and loses lift. Now keep your eye on the rate of descent meter As I drop down below 3,000 feet per minute, approaching 4, and I'm coming down vertically, and I believe that this should actually create a VRS condition. Yet, in Flight Simulator, I'm able to stop and stabilize into a perfect hover. Now, the VRS condition is very dangerous and has been the known cause of fatal accidents. So this is a condition that pilots should know to avoid, should be trained to avoid, should fly their vehicles, even in a simulator, in such a way as that they would avoid this. Now here you can see what a normal helicopter approach is, which is slow and steady. This is the way you see helicopters fly in the real world. I take it's because they want to avoid VRS. You can see I'm keeping my rate of descent within about 500 feet per minute. I don't know what the correct rate is, but that seems to be about the right rate for a helicopter descent. Now moving on to another area is something called mast bumping. And this is something that a two-bladed helicopter has trouble with, where they cannot do certain maneuvers like a low G maneuver or a nose over maneuver where you push the cyclic forward in an accelerated descent. This can cause the kind of damage that would have your rotor separate from the helicopter. Notice the difference here in the nose over versus the proper way to descend off of a cliff, let's say, where you come in and you're flying in level, but you reduce the collective, you don't push the cyclic forward. This is the correct maneuver. The other way, pushing the nose down in a two-bladed helicopter like the 206B3, has the potential of causing catastrophic damage. The difference between these two methods of descent is not modeled in Flight Sim. Now, my apologies in advance. The replay function does not seem to allow all the gauges and indicators on the console to operate correctly. But here I tried to demonstrate that pushing the collective to maximum torque, in this case it reached something like 150%, which is way in excess of what this helicopter model should tolerate. The manual indicates no more than 97% for something like 3 seconds, and yet I can push this to 150% and the helicopter just flies funny and nothing seems to happen. I don't get any kind of failure or degradation in any other aspects. I get no warnings. It just continues to fly in an unusual manner. If I back off the collective and now take a dive over the cliff at the Grand Canyon to achieve maximum speed, you can see with my speedometer that I am exceeding the normal flight cruise speed, also the maximum allowed speed, by far excess, and nothing is happening other than the helicopter flies funny. But if I manage to keep it flying, I can continue flying at will. Nothing breaks off, nothing is damaged. I don't even get a simple, you've exceeded the bounds of the machine's capabilities. I just keep flying. Now there are other examples, ludicrous examples of bad pilot behavior, other more obscure examples that I'm less familiar with, like loss of tail rotor effectiveness or settling with power. Here we have an example of doing a somersault, a barrel roll. That is prohibited behavior in the MD 500. In all cases, none of this is modeled correctly. Now, why does that matter? Well, because if you actually wanted to do that in a real helicopter, you would probably die. If you wanted to do any of these other things I mentioned, the vertical ring state can kill you, the mast bumping can kill you. If you don't know how to avoid these situations, because Flight Simulator doesn't simulate them, you become accustomed to bad habits that give you the confidence that you're a great helicopter pilot, but you're not. And of course, none of us are, we're just flight simmers. But some of us like to pretend that we would be good pilots. and we would be misled, because if we actually got into a real helicopter, we would instantly die, because we have the bad habits of not knowing how you actually handle these vehicles. So I'm just bringing this point up. I wish that flight sim was a little bit more accurate in simulating the things that are more fringe cases, but are actual life-preserving cases. I'd be curious to hear any of your comments, and may I encourage you to consider how you're handling these birds when you get that feeling of that rotor wash over you.